Well, good evening, everyone. I get a little emotional still when I see that. I'm here today to give you a little backstory behind what we went through. Is there anyone here not from Ohio during that time? If you could raise your hand. But most of us are. We had sort of a little unique thing going on here. So we're going to try to explain it to you tonight. First of all, Kara, I just want to thank you so much for including me. Yes, it is true. I had a pretty rough childhood at the beginning in Ohio, and just seeing this program and what it is doing, I would have died to have participated and could have really benefited. And so this is just such a wonderful work you and your team are doing. So I'm so glad you're all here. And I want to give you some backstory. Someday there'll be history books and things written, but these are a few behind the scenes, maybe stories that you didn't maybe hear in the media at the time. And also what I've learned since that moment. So I'll start off with one. First of all, they do that linguistics analysis, right? Like that, and to know me, and you'll see here today with my emphatic hand gestures. Well, I'd love to say I picked my I and my you and my we, but it was nothing like that. In fact, I was completely unscripted. And if anyone knows, in politics, that never happens. And it's a real testament to the governor and his team to let me be who I was in that moment. And in fact, a few months before, I had actually tripped over my aging dog, had a little dog gate. I tripped over it, landed on my hip, fractured my pelvis, was on a walker. So this is right before COVID. And I missed the training that the CDC had for teaching you how to spin. Again, it's looking back, a serendipity, because I'm quite certain I would have stood there and been afraid to say some of the things maybe I said, but I didn't know any better. I was being myself. I was being a doctor. When a doctor, you know, you're just used to having to tell people some hard things and then saying, I'll come alongside you on this journey. My kids would say it was just mom, very much so. And but that was completely unscripted. And I'll start with one story, the Not All Heroes Wear Capes. So the t-shirt you saw worn. So very early in the pandemic, right in the month of March, I got a call from Ryan Vessler, who is the owner of Homage, the really cool apparel company. And he said that I was trending, which to my family does not go unnoticed. I eventually had, I guess, 55,000 Twitter followers, and I've never once tweeted. And he said to me, you know, I'd really like, you know, I had been working on youth homelessness for the Columbus Foundation before I got a call out of the blue from a governor I did not know. And he said, I'd like to raise money. I just want to help in some way as a business during this time. And he was going to do a Dr. Amy t-shirt. And I said to him that night, you know, you are going to know me for about 3 weeks. It was a little longer, but, you know, not much in the scheme of things. Before this pandemic is over, there are going to be so many heroes. It is going to be a relay race, a baton passed from person to person to person. It is so true. There is not one person in any capacity who did not have to lead in ways they never anticipated, whether you were a school teacher like my husband, or running a whole medical center in college, or being in a nursing home, or being a university president, or all these jobs. Everyone was going to have to lead. And that's when he came up with Not All Heroes Wear Capes. And that meme spread everywhere. It spread around the world, raised tons, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars for youth homelessness. But that was the beginning of our journey together. And the truth of this all is I am a very ordinary person who found myself in a very extraordinary moment in the crosshairs of history. Then I want to share with you what that was like. So I did not know the governor. I am not a political person. I actually did a lot of child advocacy in my work. I started out in peds before preventive medicine. And I was taught to stay like nonpartisan so I could really get along with everyone, which I really was able always to do my whole career. And then I got a call out of the blue. So this just goes to show in the work you're doing, you just don't always know who you are meeting. And it turned out I had met his closest advisor from his whole career for 1 hour, working on a foundation, a healthcare conversion foundation that we were giving away money. She had seen the work I was trying to do on youth homelessness. And literally, my husband and I are driving down the road, and I get a call, and she's like, "I'm with the governor. He'd like to meet you. Would you like to come in?" And and I remember going in to meet with the governor, and it's at the top of Rife, this big tall building, and everybody stood up when he walked in the room. They all sat down, and then he pulled out this little crumpled brown paper bag. And started to eat his lunch. and Fran, it turns out, on every airplane, everywhere I've gone, I went to Haiti with him, and this brown paper bag comes, and he was so disarming, and he said, and all he said to me was, "Tell me about your childhood. Tell me where you grew up." And for whatever reason, being as nervous as I just was completely honest. And I wasn't thinking about a job. I just knew I had this chance to maybe advocate for some things that I hoped he would work on in child policy. And I got so excited at one point, I grabbed him by the arm, because I do that with patients and talking to people. And then the room froze. And I literally paused and I said out loud, "Oh my God, don't touch the governor." Totally true. Scurried away after the meeting. I remember getting on the elevator, and I literally thought to myself, "Oh my God, they would never want to put me in front of a camera." And half hour later, I got this text from the governor that he wanted to meet again. And that just took me on this adventure for the year even before this happened of amazing work that I was privileged enough to get to do. And I did tell him about that I grew up in Youngstown up to the age of 12 in really rough circumstances. And one of the things I learned there, what drew me into preventive medicine and public health, is that I learned that only a third of the things that affect your health are in your individual control. And we have to do all those things. But 2/3 of the things, 25 of the 30 years of life expectancy we gained in the last century, comes from things that we can only solve collectively. Started with clean water, safe food, child labor laws, traffic laws. I could go on and on. That most of the things that give us the ability and the conditions to be healthy and go from living 40-some year spans to 70s and 80s, and also going backwards now, come from things that we solved collectively as a society. And so kids that were just as smart as me and just as nice, literally, I got removed at the age of 12, plunked not even a mile away, but in a steady school, not moving around all the time, a really good school, stayed there for the last 7 years. And it changed my trajectory, and I just saw our lives go different ways. And to me, that was the underlying thing that got me to want to get to the causes behind the causes. So let me tell you about the beginning of the pandemic. We were having great things going on in Ohio. We actually passed Tobacco 21. Lots of wonderful things. Started a foundation for public health that Eric knows about. And then it was end December, and I heard a radio story, a BBC story, with a World Health Organization epidemiologist who, a renowned person, but I could just hear this quiver in her voice. And it made me pay attention. I was flying back from California visiting my boys who live out there. And I came in the airport in Columbus, and I noticed that all the colleges were getting together, like OU was one of them. They're standing there with their signs, and there are all these folks coming back, lots of students coming from China and professors who had traveled abroad. And it was like this aha in my mind as I'm hearing about this pneumonia, but noticing we live in this world where everybody's going everywhere. Turns out Wuhan is our sister state for Ohio. We'd had a big delegation come for business in January, meeting with the lieutenant governor. we're in this world where we are completely connected, interdependent. And I think my childhood, and I say this to people in the room because I know there are people here with lots and lots of stories of how you have grown up. But there are some things that you'll always deal with when you come from a background that never go away, and that some of the students and people you're working with will never, ever leave behind. There are also strengths. One of my strengths is being a little hypervigilant, and so I started to notice some clues early on. And that quiver and that voice. So I got back and I asked our epidemiologist to look into this new virus, and actually Ohio started preparing in the second week of January when nobody was preparing. You look a little bit like Chicken Little, the sky is falling, as I was begging the governor's team to do this big tabletop war game exercise, which we did in mid-February. The whole of the cabinet, the National Guard, everywhere, they were like, we don't want to do that, that'll get people scared. And I'm like, no, let's just do it, we'll feel really better if we do. And we were so glad we did. There were things like that that just came from who I am, but also like paying attention to the clues. I noticed that the press conferences were getting a little unhinged, watching Secretary Azar, and I just remember saying to my staff, I just don't feel like they've got this together yet. A lot of people don't know that the first pandemic playbook was created by George W. Bush immediately after 9/11 as they developed Homeland Security. Many, many serendipities in my story here. But he had read and was given John Barry's book, The Great Influenza, about the 1918 flu. And what they realized was that a pandemic, either biologic or natural, is one of the gravest security risks to this country. So put all the death and everything that we have been through on the side, it completely untethers everything in the world, as we've now seen. It had more supply chains. We could not get amoxicillin in this country. We had Hunger Games over masks in this country. And it lets bad actors take advantage of people being that unmoored. So it became a real security risk. And this playbook had been passed from president to president. Turns out, I hired a new communications director, and she started 4 days before you first really started to see me on TV. And had some great candidates, picked her, and she said to me, my brother knows a little bit about wastewater treatment, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, what's that even? And why are you telling me this? And it turned out they had grown up in Ohio. He had gone to my med school. He helped write the pandemic playbook in the White House for George W. Bush. And I'm like, I think I'd like to talk to him. And that was one of the many serendipities that would happen. Because I was able to talk to him, by this point, all the scientists had gone underground when they had started telling what they were doing. They were being attacked and silenced. There is a book by Michael Lewis called The Premonition, which he details this in great detail. There's something called the Red Dawn, where scientists who had worked on many, many of the worst pandemics around the world were trying to help each other. And then when they saw people take action, they tried to get to them and give them the knowledge. Because we were supposed to run this federally, and it was quiet federally. I also happened to be in the White House the last week of February. I sort of sucker-like took a job of being the representative for the whole Midwest to the CDC. I ended up sitting in rooms with people who had just been to the Japanese princess docked, who were seeing what was going on in the conferences in Boston. Literally people who had worked for multiple presidents, shaking in their shoes. They couldn't exactly say what was going on, but again, just the verbal, nonverbal kinds of experience, you knew you were right on the precipice. And I sat in a room with all these great virologists and epidemiologists and Mick Mulvaney, the president's chief of staff. And it went around the room, and everyone said their best advice to the president's team. It got to me, everything had been said. And I don't know where this came from, but in that moment I just said, because I think I was like a lot of you longing for this, I said, please tell the president that this is the higher angels moment. This is the FDR, Winston Churchill moment, like, we're gonna go to war. Now, sadly, we're going to go to war with an invisible enemy. If we had aliens invading from outer space, we'd be all like, okay, we're all on the same team. If you could throw green dye on this virus and little Ghostbuster blobs were popping around, we'd be like, yeah, we're on the same team. Instead of it being turned toward one another. And that was the moment. Literally, the stock market crashed the second time. I got in an airplane, I flew back, went straight to Metro Health where the governor and I were going to have a press conference looking at their super special infectious disease unit. And we came out and we said, we are going to tell you what we know as we know it. Those were our exact words. And we made that commitment, and that's what we did. And we picked 2 p.m. every day because we needed the press to be able to get to press, get it published. And we knew we had so many questions coming, we'd just be more efficient. And it was the Ohio News Network, so I consoled myself that no one was going to watch this, truthfully. And in the beginning, it was just us and the reporters. And then as things started to unfold, literally, we were all in a room together. The reporters, again, we're in a time when everyone's going through the same thing at the same time. Their parents are in nursing homes. Everyone was experiencing this. Eventually, we had to sequester, as we learned more about the virus, to just the governor actually has asthma. So we were protecting the governor. It was ultimately the lieutenant governor, the governor, me, and one camera guy standing there with one camera and one lens. And if you've never done TV or anything like this, it's a blank circle. Like, you can't see anything when you're talking to a camera like that. But before the end of it, on the other side was all of us. And you could feel it. You could feel it. When in history do all of us end up in one space like that? And this has been studied. A Kenyan professor called it a ritualized holding space. It really became sort of this sacred space. It's one of the lessons I've really learned as a leader, that we have to create these safe spaces and places of trust. And that's where it all began. We started making those hard decisions. It started with the Arnold Classic, super spreader event coming, 250,000 attendees, 80 countries. We were right on that precipice. Literally leave that Cleveland Metro Health. We're driving back. I'm talking to the health commissioner and the mayor in Columbus. This thing's about to start. And we all gathered, and like every other decision we made, so hard grab all the best people you could possibly get in a room, the best brains, literally have Arnold Schwarzenegger's voice on the phone, who totally understood it, being a past governor. And they voluntarily agreed to downsize the event substantially. We may have never even written an order, except we needed it for the insurance reasons and to recover. So they actually agreed to downsize. And that was the first decision. It was like that from that day on, one after another after another. But we were following that pandemic playbook. We had to stop an election and postpone it. Huge decision. That would be studied legally forever. But again, we got to this moment where the CDC was changing how many people could be together. I was working with Frank LaRose to try to keep the election going. We were doing everything we could. Elderly couldn't work the polls. That's who works the polls. But my husband, a teacher, was home. So then we were like, can we get the teachers to work the polls? How do we do this? And then right before the election, it went to 50 people as mass gathering, and then to 10. And the governor and his whole team, we sat around and made this decision. How do you pit someone's right to vote against their health? And so we'll delay this election. And that's how a very hard decision got made. And I can't tell you the stories behind that. They'll all come out someday. So let me talk a bit about those 3 concepts that they sort of called from what we did in those press conferences. Because I have found now, watching leader after leader, being able to talk to a governor and multiple governors, but even with the president's team when he was coming in, working with Ron Klain and others, these things have really stood with me. They said one thing before. They said brutal honesty, vulnerability, and empowerment. But they also said you have to own it. So at the very beginning, they very softly say you have to own it. What we finally realized was there was no cavalry coming. We had warehouses full of equipment and PPE. I had been trained, I have emergency code numbers. You go in, you open the door, it was all expired. I mean, every nightmare you could think of, we would purchase PPE and have a boat coming into port, and another country would outbid, and the boat would turn around and go somewhere else. And our hospitals were outbidding each other for equipment. And so we were having to pull everyone together. Let's not outbid each other. How do we do it? We were solving things that had never been solved. I'm figuring out, we're running out of embalming fluid. I have huge trucks that are morgues. We're watching what's happening in Italy, in New York, and knowing that that could happen here. So these are this is what's going on in the background. The governors, the Republican governors, got together outside the White House, and they started sharing stuff with one another. All the politics fell away. There was none of what you usually hear. There was a brief time, it was again like the 9/11, those 4 days afterwards where there was not a stranger on the street in the world. That lasted a good almost 6 weeks in Ohio. And these governors would help, and then they immediately would reach across the aisle. We were working with Gretchen Whitmer and Andy Bashir. We all started rowing. And I saw how Larry Hogan was using his National Guard, and I'm like, we've got to get our Guard to do this, and that. We just started all solving problems together that way. It was really in many ways an amazing thing. But again, we're fighting a war. No one's naming it a war. I literally at one point, I'm a global health professor as well. I Googled the word pandemic at one time because the World Health Organization was not naming it a pandemic. I mean, these were strange times. But you get to choose whether your war is going to look more like Vietnam or is it going to look like World War II, but you're going to war. And that was the thing. So owning it was, this is it. And I'm so proud of Ohio and what it did. People do not understand how bad this disease was in the beginning. I mean, doctors, we did not know how to treat this disease yet. We had a learning curve. The mortality rate in March dropped from I've heard estimates from 40 to 50% if you were in a hospital, down to about 5% by June. We just did not know what to do. And believe me, as a doctor, you're so excited. You get someone in a hospital, you've got a ventilator, you've got all the equipment and your people, you're going to be able to do something. And you can't pump oxygen into someone, and they're suffocating in front of you. And this is the trauma all the folks on the front line were experiencing over and over. What was going on in nursing homes, what was going on in prisons and homeless shelters. I mean, it was a brutal, brutal time. But that said, we started inventing things and doing things in Ohio. And the whole goal, you can't stop this virus. It was already past containment by the time it was here. It was spread and spread and spread. It was already here. I was pretty certain we had seen excess influenza. It was probably here in December. We know of cases that date back to then and deaths. We were seeing excess death. But what we were able to do was give people the honest truth, the brutal honesty of what we knew, and let everyone start solving for themselves. And we needed to slow the spread so that our systems weren't overwhelmed. Again, what do you do when that paramedic gets sick and can't drive the one ambulance in a lot of these counties that we're talking about here, right? I'm good, thank you. We're in an emergency operating room system, this big NASA-like place with screens on the wall. We're running this emergency response. But I'm what happens if my team goes down? This is the war that we are in. So that brutal honesty allowed people to have the information and start to make decisions. And again, I could go on and on about the heroics in the state. My real dream is that we have a story corps that starts to capture all these individual stories, because there was ingenuity and just amazing things that were done of people. And my feeling was if we could just get everyone to pull one another up on a life raft. That was the image I had in my head standing there in some of those press conferences. If I can just say one thing and you can grab a few more people up on a life raft, and you if enough of us do the right thing, most of the time, all of us get through. And I knew not everyone would do everything right, but I knew if enough of us did, we would flatten that curve, and we did, and the data now shows it. It's been in the Lancet. And that trajectory, it's kind of like a baseball bat, that slight change of an angle right at the bat can have a just profound effect of where a baseball goes. And by being able to slow the spread and allow our systems to get a hold of it, and hospitals, where we were building field hospitals, like I said, I'm figuring out where do I get embalming fluid now? And we were able to do enough to slow it. It did, we saw the numbers we predicted. We saw them by December. You never want to see your predictions come true about 12,000 cases. You just don't want to see that. And I have to tell you, the data that we had to get, we do not have in the state data analysts who can do that at the Ohio Department of Health. They're in private industry or they're in academia. Our computer systems are so old. You've heard about the unemployment system. Our disease reporting system was so old, we couldn't get people to code for it. One of the problems with public health, and I would share this with the legislature, it's silent victories. When we do everything right, when we knock it out of the park, you don't see what we prevented. As we started to flatten that curve, you don't see what we're preventing. Therefore, you don't fund it, you don't invest in it. But meanwhile, these are the things. We want government to be efficient. These are public servants that are our neighbors and friends, and they're professionals. We want them to have the tools to do their job. We ended up getting academic people. We called them the force. All these professors donated their time. I threw them in a room, and they started cranking numbers. And that's how Ohio solved it a little differently and got the numbers we did. I mean, it's really, again, it's an unbelievable story. But brutal honesty meant that once we told the truth, the best people in the world, Paul Farmer, one of my heroes and partners in health who died recently, one of the greatest global health doctors at Harvard, Jim Young Kim from the World Health Bank, tell me what was going on in South Korea and what data and new apps they were using. The best people in the world came to us, and Ohio got out ahead. And it is really an amazing thing. So let's go on to vulnerability. Vulnerability, when I said that line, I'm not afraid, I'm determined. It's not that you don't feel fear, but there's something about the moment you're in, and we never know when we're going to face it. All of us are going to face moments that come find us when we least expect it, and you can't look the other way. There's something about 11.7 million patients and not wanting one person to suffer that really locks and loads you. And I remember a morning where I would get up at 4 o'clock. It was the only time I had. I'd start with all these doctors all over the state and medical centers. One morning where I just felt that everything in my life, it was just like, whew, all the things I'd ever done, all these random paths I've ever taken, all the mistakes I've ever made, somehow were just like all the things I needed in that moment. It was the oddest feeling. It just was like you get very focused. And it's not that you don't feel fear, but you too, in this circumstance, would have done anything to save lives, and so many of you did. So, vulnerability is like having heart and courage comes from the word core, heart. And what I said one time in a press conference is it's not shutting us down, it's opening us up. And what we are going through, and still are going through, is breaking our hearts. People have had hearts broken everywhere. There's tremendous loss, tremendous amount of moral injury of things we see that we can't unsee now. That was actually a line, when I said that line that day of shutting down, that my husband, elementary school teacher, 40 years, coach, said to me as I was walking out the door that morning. He's like, "You're not afraid, you're determined." I'm like, "Okay, yes I am." "Yes, coach." And so don't forget what you're saying, these things that we ground back in. I don't want to make light of the bad. The bad was bad. Very early on, I was given executive protection. I thought they just wanted me to work. At first, they're like, hey, you can work in the back of the little limo car because you have so much you're doing, and we'll just drive you. Like, they're like kind of trying to break it to me easy. And then we had 24/7 state highway patrol in our driveway. We live in a very normal middle-class house in a normal, no-gated community. Like, from here to the back wall is my picture window to the sidewalk. But what they realized early on is the same kind of cell, the people we saw at January 6th, the people who ultimately were after Gretchen Whitmer, were after the governor and I as well. And there was a press conference. It was live, it's recorded, where the governor was saying some things to me in mid-April, like it was Easter and Passover. I'm Jewish, my husband's Episcopal, we celebrate all these holidays in our house. And he said something like very loose to me, like, I hope you have a good Seder tonight. I know you're doing a virtual Seder because people had dropped off food at my house doorstep and we're going to go on the computer. And I said something like to the lines of, I make a mean bowl of matzo ball soup, Governor, or something, like, just joking. Well, they had been trying to find ways to sort of, denigrate a lot of the health officers. It was a very, very deliberate attack that was going on in multiple states. People were being removed from their jobs and were starting to get ugly. But it was that moment, it was the matzo ball soup moment, where the very next press conference, maybe from this back table to the wall is the lieutenant governor in the state house, thin panes of glass, people pressed up with Guy Fawkes masks, giant, guns, automatic weapons, screaming, and you can actually hear the screaming on the press conference. Ironically, I was interviewing a Black physician about making sure we get to minorities, and there's a picture in this press conference that said, be kind, and it had a mother holding her child. Be kind. It was just, again, you can't make this up. And I remember saying out loud, it's hard to hear me today because you're hearing this in the background. And that was sort of the beginning of it. Finding out that I was Jewish led to a lot of anti-Semitic stuff coming, unfortunately, from legislators and others. It started with the rats, it just began from there, and then people going around our neighborhood and dealing with that. So that is all real. My kids were stalked where they live in multiple states. My husband had, being out on a playground at an elementary school, had somebody come up with a big package to deliver it, and they had to shut the school down. I mean, this stuff is real. That's happening to people who have the courage in all the ways they do public service. So yes, that was real. It was ugly. It needs accountability. That said, the love was so much greater than the hate. I cannot tell you, we have mailrooms. The governor has a mailroom. I had a mailroom this big. You could not walk through these mailrooms for all the things Ohioans were making and sending and doing. My house filled up with letters. I mean, it was, people started trying to make meaning out of this. They started doing art. I said something like, this virus has 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon spread, because like I'm coming up with metaphors, right? And next thing you know, there's a giant 6-foot Bacon statue in a corporate park in Cincinnati. There's the beautiful, like, Laverne and Shirley skit that a man did that, oh my God, if you have not seen it, it was one of the best things I've ever seen. People started making memes, as you saw, the little kids, the chalk drawings, my refrigerator filled up with little COVID drawings. And I would bring some of those with me to the press conferences. I didn't get to see a lot of it, the fan thing. My husband would pick out a few things just to cheer me up at night. It was all happening so fast. I really wasn't seeing much of the love or the hate at that moment, but bridges started to light up, and you just started to see Ohioans doing these things. There was a woman named Bonnie Bowen, 92 years old. She did watercolors every day of the pandemic on the Facebook page. Day 1, day 2, day 200 and something. They're very whimsical. People love them. She got COVID. Hundreds of thousands of prayer messages came to her from all over the country, and she got through it. She had purpose in what she was doing, and she wasn't alone, and she felt that love, and that her daughter said to me, this got her through. So there's so many stories like that. I said something, Kara mentioned, I would say books. I'd say random things like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, I talked about Joseph Campbell and the hero's adventure and the study of all world mythologies. Again, unscripted, but whatever would happen in these days, we would just share it, and people would go out and buy books and do things. I said something about the Colbert Show. I said, Michael Stipe was on, and he did a song that you might want to listen to called There's No Time for Love Like Now. So go listen to it, No Time for Love Like Now. And he did it sort of singularly on the Colbert Show, and I got a call from Michael Stipe. So those are the kinds of things that are happening. He was telling me how his whole team went down, and he was in Georgia, and what was happening with his family, and his worry about how much hate was going on in the world. And so we started to say things. A mom and her kid made signs that said, "Act on love, not hate." A play on my last name, "Act on love, not hate." And these signs started going everywhere. And so again, we in Ohio started to have memes like "Act on love, not hate," "Act on kindness, not fear." Because what we really have realized and what we've been through is there is a contagion far more viral and contagious than just this virus as we saw. It's the hate. It's the intolerance for ambiguity. These are very tough times. They are not over by any stretch. But that act on love, that kindness, not fear, that became a big thing in Ohio. So that leaves me with my last thing for you. I had a sense, again, that I had to give people ways to act. So empowerment was actually one of the deliberate things I think I was intentional about. We are living in a time really unparalleled in my life experience, but certainly not throughout all of history. There was a study that came out of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, bipartisan report on democracy. It came out in 2020, so it got kind of quietly not seen. But it was about our common purpose. And it talked about the fact that we are probably in the fourth founding of our country during this phase we're in. We have the beginning of our country, we have Reconstruction, we had the Civil Rights era, and now we are in a time of great change. And what you start to realize is that, maybe we had grown complacent, so many things that we just take for granted as being here. But then when you really look back at your history, you realize that every generation, and this is you now, has to co-create the world we want to live in. It never ends. We have to do it generation and generation again. And that is the moment. It's actually in the disruption and the chaos, which is profound and complicated, there's also great openings. I could solve problems during the pandemic that I could never solve in a million years, because there's openings right now. There are benefits from the pandemic. We learned about nature. I think a lot more people are appreciating the impact of nature. We have all the science to show that awe and wonder and being out, literally changes your neurochemistry, like what we're doing right here. People found that. People found that the supply chain was not working, and we're changing that, and that's great for the state of Ohio. I can't tell you enough what a great moment this is if we can capture it, and what a beautiful state this is if we can capture the beauty. We are not the Rust Belt anymore. We have got to stop thinking of ourselves that way. There's so much potential here and in this region. So you are at a very, very precious moment right now. We're reemerging. You get to reimagine things. This generation, especially our younger generation, yes, they're going to say you've gone through so much, and there is trauma. The Surgeon General just came out with a new advisory about the impact of loneliness and the need for connection, and how this undergirds almost every epidemic we have, all the diseases of despair. We are having racial reckonings. All of this is going on, but it is a very fertile time. We are rushing on. Things happen with the pandemic, and our natural inclination is to get back to life. But the truth is, we have seen things we can't unsee. And it's in us, and I see it in people everywhere I go in this state. Moral injury is not mean you have bad mental health. We are born moral beings. I really believe we're not born sinning beings. We are born with moral capacity. And it's something that we have to constantly, collectively, keep building and reinforcing in ourselves. When you see some of the hard things we've seen, yes, there's PTSD from watching and losing a patient or seeing a kid suffer or suicide. But there's also a collective kind of, oh my gosh, this kind of stuff is going on around us. And there's a part of us that is being called to action when we see things like that. And it is uncomfortable and it hurts. And that is also part of what we're bearing right now in the unmooring. But don't always just see that as something's wrong with me. When you put your finger on a stove and you pull off, that's a reflex, right? And sometimes very things that we're feeling, even the anxiety and depressions and things that are really our body's way of saying, pay attention. And so this is a moment where we're feeling a lot. Eventually, just like 9/11, when we're a little more distant, we're going to have to pause. We are going to have to mourn all we have lost, because we have lost a lot, including some innocence about things. We are going to have to make meaning out of all we endured. And we will memorialize that, I hope, in really thoughtful ways around this world. Because again, we faced something together. All of us were in this together. And I have great hopes for you. This is the perfect time for leadership. This is a perfect time where your gifts are needed. I read that poem, Cargo. I can't think of that just resonated so much with me. All of us have great potential. We don't always know what it is and stumble around in it. I've stumbled my whole life. I'm still stumbling. And then all of a sudden you will see something you can't unsee, and you will try to unsee it. I know I have many a time. I do not see that. I do not see, oh, I see that. And then you will take that responsibility and you'll find some great people and you'll grab them and you'll go after it. So I'm going to stop with that. I'd love to hear all your thoughts, experiences, questions, but it was the honor of a lifetime to serve. I was a tip of hundreds of thousands of people serving, and it was an honor to share this with you. So thank you.